Today I'm going to show you one of my dishes that I think is quite interesting and unique, and a good example of how I work creatively on food, often layering together numerous techniques to get the depth of flavour and intensity that I want in a small course. It's a dish served early in the tasting menu of osmanthus and seaweed marinated tofu, stuffed with spiced mushrooms, pickled apple, and served with this vibrant blue algae miso sauce. It's delicious, dramatic, and unusual. I'm going to show you how I make the whole dish and also how I layer up different techniques, some of which I've made videos about before, things like how to make koji and Shio Koji, how to make your own misos, and I'll talk about all of these in a moment. Then I use aromatics from Distilled Osmanthus Flowers to give you these peachy stone fruit aromas added into the blue algae miso sauce, which then gets clarified through a centrifuge to get it as clear and bright as possible. There's a punch of spice as well from the cooked shiitake mushrooms, and then the dish is finished with pickled apple for this bright, fresh top note. It's always an extra challenge when you've got an attention-grabbing presentation that the flavours have not only got to meet but exceed that expectation that's set by the appearance. The last thing that you would want is for the dish to feel anticlimactic. It's so disappointing when something looks beautiful but the experience of eating it just doesn't match up. That's one of the reasons that this dish uses a lot of hidden work and layered up techniques to give complex savoury flavours that are punchy but carefully balanced. You really want the creative and visual aspect around a dish to help to draw people in and to make it memorable, but for the flavour to be the most important thing and still exceed their expectations. So I'll put links to those detailed technique videos down in the video description along with the whole recipe. But I hope that a video like this gives you a realistic sense of how I use these techniques to make something creative and complex, but that's grounded in simple principles for building up deliciousness. Let's start off with this blue algae miso sauce, which gives us umami and a flavour of the sea, the aromas of osmanthus flowers, and that really striking natural blue colour. It starts off with the blue algae miso that I make, and I've made a detailed technique video about how to make your own misos, so as I say, that will be linked down in the video description. Essentially here, I followed my usual miso making principles and made a miso from a mixture of edible blue algae. And here I use 5% salt and ferment this miso for between 4 and 6 months. The blue algae has a nice flavour of the sea that rounds out through the fermentation, and we end up with this very unique miso that gives us our start point for making the sauce. The other key elements for making this sauce will be a distilled osmanthus flower hydrosol and a cold infused dashi. The water-based osmanthus distillation is going to allow me to add the beautiful aromatics of osmanthus flowers to the sauce, but without introducing any bitterness or tannins. I make this by infusing osmanthus flowers at really high concentration into water and then distilling this mixture at low temperature through the rotovap. I've done a number of videos about the rotovap, but essentially what it's letting me do is distill things at low pressures and therefore at low temperatures. So this mixture, for example, I distill at not much over room temperature, and it lets me capture and isolate the aromas of the osmanthus flowers, but without damaging or changing those with heat. Normally I'm doing these kinds of distillations with alcohol, but it does work well with water-based distillations too, and you can think of these hydrosols as very similar to something like rose water, except I'm getting to choose the flavours that I want to work with, and here I've focused in on those lovely peach aromas of osmanthus, and by doing this at such low temperatures, I really preserve the integrity and clarity and freshness of that flavour. The other element to this sauce is the cold infused dashi, which is really simple to make. I'm just infusing my seaweed into the cold water overnight to make this lightly flavoured umami rich stock. So I make my blue algae miso sauce by combining my miso, my cold infused dashi and my Osmanthus hydrosol, and then I want to clarify this to get a beautifully clear sauce. So I do that by spinning it in my centrifuge, which separates out any of the cloudy elements by weight and leaves you with this beautiful crystal clear blue miso sauce. Then the next step is to make the marinated tofu element for this dish. And I make a marinade using another cold infused dashi that has a little osmanthus added to that too, so that we have that thread of flavour running throughout the whole dish. I add a little bit of Shio Koji to this too, and then I fry my tofu before placing it in this marinade to infuse. I've covered this technique for marinating tofu before, and it's a really useful, incredibly simple technique to use, and a great way of getting tons of flavour into tofu and using it as a sort of blank canvas that then gives you incredible flexibility. Once it's marinated, I trim the tofu and then partially hollow it out to give some space to stuff it with the spiced shiitake mushrooms. I'm just going to quickly go over the shiitake element here, but again, all the details are going to be down in the video description. Essentially, I rehydrate some shiitake mushrooms, and then these get cooked along with some spices. Once they're cooked nicely, they get roughly chopped in a blender and then covered over with oil to store. I stuff my marinated tofu with some of this mushroom mixture, which gives us more nice umami and a little kick of that spice. And then lastly, the tofu is topped with some blueberry pickled apple. For this, I make a very simple blueberry vinegar by blending vinegar, sugar and fresh blueberries and then straining that mixture. And then I vacuum pickle my fresh raw apple in that blueberry vinegar so that I get it lightly pickled, but I still retain all the fresh crispness of the raw apple. This just adds a nice, fresh, bright contrast to the umami that's running through the tofu and the blue algae miso sauce. And then, with all those elements prepared, I can put together the finished dish. The stuffed tofu goes into the dish, topped with a little bit of that blueberry pickled apple. And then I slightly conceal this under a petal from nasturtium flowers that grow in my raised beds. Then the clarified blue algae miso sauce is poured into the dish. And I just finished the dish off with a few drops of Osmanthus flower infused olive oil. Hopefully seeing one of my dishes like this as a whole gives you a sense of how I'm approaching the food, and the fact that none of these techniques are just used for the sake of it. In fact, because I'm working on my own here in the kitchen and the tasting menu is made up of 14 dishes, I really don't want to do anything that isn't valuably adding deliciousness and impact into the experience of eating a dish. Do check out the videos that I mentioned are linked in the description if you want to see some of the techniques that I've used here in more detail, and also tag me or send me your photos if you end up trying to make any aspects of this. It's always really interesting for me to see. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.